Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who's the Dr. Alexander Motyl. Dr. Motyl is a historian and expert on Soviet Union, Ukraine, and Russia. He's the author of many books. And of course, that if you follow our show, you know Dr. Motyl always offer fresh insights and also analysis, help us understand the situation and also the future of Ukraine. Well, Dr. Motyl, and welcome back to the show.
For having me, Will, and thanks to your audience for listening.
Well, again, Dr. Motyl, thank you so much for taking your time to join the show. Again, I want to get started. I know your time is very, very busy. Now, let's talk about this statement, or the statements came out of Finland's president. Again, as I mentioned in the intro, that was only a portion of what he said, but I do want to emphasize that later on he kept on repeating the point, and I quote, "The reality is visible from space, and satellite imagery shows Ukrainian military cemeteries horrifically expanding relentless across the country. New sections added, new rows, graves that never make the official count, and some 2 million obituaries that never make it to Western climate media official counts," end quote. Dr. Motyl, from your perspective, we know that today, from Finland's perspective, it's rather anxious about this instability of the world. And also, we're still paying attention to the war between US and Iran, and also the war in Ukraine. So from your perspective, based on your understanding, what do you think of Finland's president trying to signify when he made those statements? And how do you think that today, especially the NATO members, are they under tremendous pressure from the West when we talk about this global disorder? Your thoughts?
Finland's president is correct in saying remember, a few weeks ago, Finland's president was very open and said Russia is losing the war. So these comments have to be seen in that particular context. He is persuaded, as am I, as your readers know from having listened to me in the past, Russia is not doing well. And quite the opposite. In the last few weeks, Ukraine suddenly has become a military, or at least is perceived as a military superpower. 2-3 weeks ago, Russia launched its spring offensive. And the result of the spring offensive is that Ukraine recaptured several hundred square kilometers of territory. Not exactly a success story. Equally important, as you know, President Zelensky has signed 3 deals with Arab states, offering them Ukraine's expertise with drones. And in exchange, they'll presumably be more interested in assisting Ukraine, perhaps by investing. I mean, at this point, it's still unclear. But this is a major victory for Ukraine. Finally, what needs to be emphasized is, as a result of the war in Iran, the price of oil has zoomed upwards. And that, of course, means that Russia has benefited from the windfall profits. However, Ukraine has simultaneously responded by destroying possibly as much as 40% of Russia's export capacity. So yes, Russia has benefited from the war, but significantly less than was originally assumed to be the case. I think we can still say with certainty at this point in time that the war is still essentially a stalemate. The Ukrainians may have a bit of an advantage today. It's conceivable the Russians will have an advantage tomorrow. But the important thing to remember is, or a self-styled superpower such as Russia achieves stalemate with a significantly weaker force such as Ukraine, that qualifies as a defeat for Russia and a victory for Ukraine. If you're strong, you should win, not have a stalemate. And if you're weak, you should lose and not have a stalemate. Now, the war in Iran has complicated things for everybody, not the least of, China, Japan, South Korea import a lot of oil through the Strait of Hormuz. China, about 40%. South Korea and Japan, roughly 80 to 90%, something in that range. And these oil shortages are going to hit them, along with the Europeans, extremely hard within the next week or two. They'll have to draw on their oil reserves. Those will last them a couple of months, but if the war keeps on going on for more than a few weeks, the world's global economy will suffer enormously, and it's very possible that we'll have a global recession. The United States won't escape these problems. It may not be as affected as strongly as Japan and South Korea because it has oil reserves. But as you know, the price of gasoline in the United States has gone up by 1/3, in other words, 35% since the beginning of the war. And if the shortages continue or accelerate, that's likely to go up even more. That may not matter for many countries which rely on public transportation, but the vast majority of Americans drive cars to and from work. So to pay $4 a gallon as opposed to $3 is quite a significant increase. So we'll see how everybody responds. What's clear, and I'll end on this particular point, what seems to be clear is that Trump seems to understand that he is in a very difficult position. He was expecting the war to end in a few days, like Putin vis-a-vis Ukraine, by the way. And instead, it's now the 5th week. The war seems to have no end in sight. Now, again, it could end tomorrow. We don't know. But at this point in time, that seems highly unlikely. And the popularity and Trump's popularity and approval ratings in the United States are declining precipitously. So if he stays in the war for much longer, that will affect Republican chances in the midterm elections in November very severely. They're likely to lose both houses of Congress. But at the same time, for him simply to run away will be perceived as running away, will be perceived as a sign of weakness. So what should Trump do? Frankly, I don't know. He got himself into an enormous mess. He's gotten the United States, Iran, the Middle East, and the world into an enormous mess. And now he's flailing about, hoping that the Europeans, maybe the Japanese, maybe the South Koreans, maybe Taiwan, who knows, will save the day. Of course, they're reluctant to do so because it's not their war.
Well, again, Dr. Motyl, your answer hit on a lot of major points. Of course, that, again, you are the expert, and we know and agree with you that the beginning of the war between U.S. and Iran, it's a hot mess. And again, at this moment, not only that the international community or the NATO allies, particularly the American voters, are still unclear about the intention of having or attacking Iran at this moment. And also this relationship between Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu, it's getting more ambiguous at the same time. Now, let's talk about Volodymyr Zelensky, the sitting Ukrainian president. Now, during one recent interview, this is what he said when he was questioned regarding to set up a compromise with Russia. And again, the reaction from President Zelensky were quite strong. This is what he said, and I quote, "They think it's not a very high price because if Russia stops, the war ends. In that case, Americans will provide us with security guarantee. So in their view, we withdraw and they give us security guarantee. I've heard this more than once in different ways. It's clear to us, it's clear to Russians, and it's very clear to American side," end quote. Now, as soon as the statement or the conversation was published, Secretary of the State Marco Rubio immediately rebuked the reaction from President Zelensky and believe that America never promised anything, or at least for this administration, never promised anything about this security guarantee. Because again, based on the rhetoric from the Trump administration, it's the war that belonged to Ukraine, not the war belonged to America. So, Dr. Motyl, I know I asked you this question before, but today, look at the complication of the war. Look at the complication of the geopolitics. Is Zelensky being fooled by the Trump administration? So, in other words, how much confidence can Zelensky still place the trust under the Trump administration? Who's right? Who's wrong? What's the game plan right here? Your thoughts?
Well, I think the important thing is to understand that both sides are playing a game. The United States, at this point in time, wants Ukraine to give up territory to Russia, which is essentially the Russian position. And in return, it may or may not be inclined to provide something called security guarantees. And again, simply to say those words isn't sufficient of a security guarantee. One would need to specify very, very exactly how the United States would respond in case of a future Russian attack and so on. But that's the American position. The Ukrainian position is that it will not, cannot, should not, may not give up this territory, if only because the Constitution forbids it. Ukraine can't simply give territory away according to its own Constitution. Strategically, it would also be stupid. And last but not least, it would probably, again, according to the Ukrainian position, it would only whet Russian appetites for more Ukrainian territory. So both sides are playing a game. No one wants to look like he's responsible for the war. So the Americans are saying, yes, we support peace. The Russians are saying, well, of course we support peace. The Ukrainians are saying, yes, we too support peace. But the bottom line is that everything hinges on the details. And the Russians insist that there can only be peace if this territory is ceded to them. The Ukrainians insist there can only be peace if this territory is not ceded to them. And the Americans, they waffle. Sometimes they seem like they support the Ukrainian position. More often than not, they support the Russian position. It's been argued by many analysts that Trump has some kind of peculiar relationship with Putin, which is conceivable as well. So it's a dance, it's a play, it's theater. I don't think anyone at this point in time seriously expects a deal to be made, a breakthrough to happen, and for peace magically to appear. But given the rhetoric of image, given the question of propaganda value, everybody, of course, is for peace. But at this point in time, at least according to my views, I don't see peace any more likely today than it was a year ago.
Well, Dr. Motyl, I know you're very busy. I want to wrap up our conversation by asking you something so critical at this moment. Again, you mentioned, and of course I said it during the intro, that according to Donald Trump's social media post, that on May the 14th to the 15th, he's scheduled to pay a state visit to China. And of course, for both sides, for China and the US, this is rather critical and important, not only for this ongoing economic tension, and also both countries, especially from the leadership perspective, hoping that this visit can actually soften the tones and perhaps even some of the important and significant topics will be brought on the table. Of course, again, we talk about Russia, we talk about Iran. Both countries, from this economic standpoint, are equally essential, indispensable to China. So from your perspective, again, I'm not going to ask you how Donald Trump is going to play the cards or what Donald Trump will say during the state visit. Of course, we don't know and we'll never know until it happens. But from your perspective, how much do you believe that this visit will directly influence the war with Iran and also the ongoing war in Ukraine. So in other words, how do you think that both Russia and Iran pay attention to the state visit? Because eventually China is another critical or key player to manage, I dare to use the word manage, the U.S. at this moment. Your final thoughts.
But China could, in principle, exert an enormous amount of influence on Russia. I mean, the balance of power has shifted a bit because of the rise in oil prices. But that having been said, China is a genuine superpower. Russia is a former superpower. At this point in time, I'm not even sure it's a regional power. And if the Chinese wanted to pressure the Russians to end the war, they could certainly try. But thus far, they haven't. And my guess is that they haven't because they want Russia to be weak. A weak Russia is in China's best interest. A very strong Russia, victorious Russia, that might be inclined to additional adventures within Europe or elsewhere would be destabilizing and would not be in China's interest. So to keep the war going on and to see Russia bleed is actually good for Chinese strategic interests. I mean, for humanitarian reasons, it's a catastrophe. But I don't think Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin are terribly concerned with the well-being of their populations. So China could make a difference. In terms of the war in Iran, that's more complicated. China could pressure Iran, but Iran at this point in time has been bombarded by the Israelis and the Americans. Iran understands, the Iranian regime understands that its existence is on the line. So I'm not sure exactly what kind of concessions China could force it to make. What is of interest and what is of importance is that Trump is going to be going into these negotiations, assuming the war hasn't yet fully ended, in a decidedly weakened position. Had he started the war and achieved victory within 3 days, he could present himself as a peacemaker, as a war maker, as someone who has genuine influence throughout the world. But thus far, the war has turned into a disaster for the United States, not to mention the Iranian people. And regardless of how it ultimately ends, if it ends within the next month or two, Trump will go into these negotiations in a weakened position. I don't foresee any particular breakthroughs. China could, in principle, exert influence on Trump. It could try to do so. But Trump, being Trump, is going to say no. He's going to resist. What China is likely to say, however, is that if the United States is entitled to attack Iran for dubious reasons, then China is perhaps equally entitled to attack Taiwan. That, unfortunately, is now again, I'm not saying it's going to happen, but rhetorically and logically, the Chinese are now in a much stronger position than they were a month and a half.
Well, again, Dr. Motyl, you said it. Of course, again, going back to what I said before, this geopolitical games is getting more and more complicated. And it's time not only to figure out the solution, but also figure out a long-term plan for the international stability. Again, ladies and gentlemen, it's such an honor to speak to Dr. Alexander Motyl. Again, Dr. Motyl is a historian and a political scientist. He's the expert on Soviet Union, Ukraine, and Russia. And I strongly encourage everyone follow the work of Dr. Motyl. Well, again, Dr. Motyl, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure. I would love to have you back on the show as we continue to pay closer attention to the global affairs. So thank you so much for doing this.